Our goal should be to bring this war to a close as quickly as possible. We need a political settlement that both sides can live with and that neither side will want to overturn in the future. That settlement must provide security for Ukraine, but also for Russia, because again, it was Russia's security concerns that caused the war. That's why ending this crisis must start by acknowledging Russia's security interests. Any other course of action will do more damage to Ukraine, cause additional suffering in countries that depend on Russia and Ukraine for food, 30% of the world's supply of wheat, and increase the risk of nuclear war. That's why I support the resolution.
Yes, we all recognize that Russia has security interests, but what it would take to end this very dangerous conflict is for Russia to acknowledge that other countries, including smaller countries, and in particular, Ukraine, also have and has security interests, the right to exist, the right to be a democracy, the right to integrate with the West if they so wish. So, ladies and gentlemen, I beg to oppose.
This is a crisis that is all about the West's efforts to turn Ukraine into a Western bulwark on Russia's border.
Why is it that Putin gets to define the interests that he sees fit? Because Putin today, he's a very different person than 22 years ago or 30 years ago when I first met him in 1991. But today, Putin, it defines Russia's security interests in imperial terms, in anti-democratic terms. He believes it's in Russia's national interest to annex Crimea. Are we just supposed to go along with that? He believes that it's in Russia's national interest to declare Donbass independent countries, and he'll soon annex them as well. Are we just supposed to go along with that? He believes it's in Russia's national interest to slaughter civilians on Mariupol in the name of, and he says it, I'm sorry, Professor Mearsheimer, he says it very clearly in his speeches, to liberate Russians from the neo-Nazis that are subjugating him. In fact, in his speech, before he invaded Ukraine, 7,000-word speech, the first 4,628 of them he spoke before he ever mentioned the word NATO once. That's what he's trying to do there. And my question is, where does it stop? So Donbass, is that enough? Does he get to have all of Ukraine? I think if you just allow him to define it as he sees fit, you're down a very, very slippery slope.
The issue is not, in fact, whether we thought expanding NATO was a threat to Russia. We told them repeatedly that it wasn't a threat to Russia. The issue on the table was whether Russia thought it was a threat. And as Bill Burns reported back, all of the people he spoke to in Russia thought that the incorporation of Ukraine was a threat to Russia's vital security interests.
If Putin is a realist, is Russia more secure today than when they invaded Ukraine? No, their forces have been destroyed. Do they have more allies around the world supporting them? No. Are they more prosperous because of this invasion? No, they're going to be living with sanctions for a long time. GDP, the standard of the living in Russia on February 23rd, 2022, it's going to take them a decade to get to that. And oh, by the way, other countries, NATO was, before 2014, people, you need to remember, NATO was fading. They weren't spending any money.
Brain dead,
I think, yeah. We weren't spending
President Macron's words.
It was fading. It was not a threat to Russia. It was on its last legs. And what gave it, what reinvigorated NATO was Putin's invasion of Ukraine.
It is in Ukraine's national interest to act smartly with regard to Russia and not poke the Russian bear in the eye with a stick, because it will lead to a situation like the one that you now face. Am I happy about the fact that this is the way the world works? Absolutely not. But I am a realist, and I think Ukraine would be much better off today if it had acted according to the dictates of realism.
Professor, you can't pretend that somehow mystically Ukraine was about to become a NATO member, because we denied them the membership action plan. More than that, the Chancellor of Germany, in trying to prevent the war, spoke to Putin and in private and in public said, I give you my word that as Chancellor of Germany, Ukraine will not join NATO on my watch. So he was giving Putin a moratorium of at least 5, maybe 10, maybe even more years on Ukraine joining, because, as you know, it requires unanimity. So what you're saying is that Putin had to invade Ukraine on the hypothetical possibility that in a decade or so, Ukraine will apply again and might be accepted. That's unserious. You don't start war on that basis.
I do believe this was a strategic blunder on Putin's part. That doesn't mean he wasn't motivated by security concerns. I think Russia is going to end up worse off in the same way that the United States was worse off after it made a few catastrophic strategic blunders, like invading Iraq or fighting a war in Vietnam for 10 years or more. Sometimes great powers, when they're scared, do really stupid things and they pay a price for it. Russia has already paid a considerable price for this. They're going to continue to pay a price. But great powers also don't back down when things go bad. They double down, which is what I fear we are seeing happening. And the victims of that process, first and foremost, are going to be Ukrainians.
Putin has already got what he wanted, Ukraine's neutrality. So how much Ukrainian land are you willing to give him for peace? And how do you sell it to the Ukrainians?
Here's my question. If Ukraine membership in NATO is really, realistically off the table, just not going to happen, nothing for Russia to worry about, why shouldn't NATO take it back? Say, we've rethought the matter, we no longer want to consider Ukraine for NATO membership. If it's never going to happen, why not do a very simple thing that might help unwind this?
Because that would be an invitation for Russia to invade. And as you know, Russia,
already happened.
The United States, Britain and France guaranteed Ukraine's security and borders in return for Ukraine giving up what was then the third largest nuclear stockpile in the world back in 1994. So you have a duty to Ukraine to help them defend their liberty now.
I want to ask all the Canadians in the audience a very simple question. If in 20 years Canada formed a military alliance with China and invited China to put military forces in Canada, what do you think the United States would do? I guarantee you the United States would behave towards Canada in very similar ways to how Russia is behaving towards Ukraine. We have the Monroe Doctrine, and we would never tolerate Chinese forces in Canada. We would never tolerate Canada forming a military alliance with China. You might not like this, but this is the way the world works. And I believe Canadians are sophisticated enough to know that this is a bad idea.
Okay. I need to respond to this because I think this is relevant. Under what conditions would the Canadians seek a Chinese alliance? Only if there was an American president who announced that to make America great again, he needs to reunite with part of what was once the same country. And they speak English too, don't they?
Actually, for the historical record, we tried this once in 1812. It did not go well. The White House got burned down, and we learned our lesson. We now love our Canadian neighbors. War is always a horrible thing to behold, and what's happening in Ukraine is no exception to that. The second problem is that wars have a natural tendency to expand and to escalate. The protagonists don't want to lose. If they're doing well, their war aims expand. If they're doing badly, sometimes their war aims expand to make up for it. So they are tempted to expand or escalate the war. Outsiders sometimes get involved or try and take advantage in other ways. And the longer a war goes on, and the more people die, and the more sacrifices occur, the greater these dangers are. So you really want to try and bring this to an end as quickly as possible. I don't think anyone should underestimate the risk of escalation here. First, as Radek pointed out, that's built into Russian military doctrine, this idea of escalating to end a war. Second, as Avril Haines warned, if Russia believes that its vital interests are really being threatened, that an existential threat, including a catastrophic defeat in Ukraine, is on the table, they may consider doing this as well. And they have threatened this in veiled ways. And I would think after the last decade or so, one might want to take some of Vladimir Putin's threats seriously. All right, he got into a war in Georgia because he didn't want Georgia to move towards Ukraine. He intervened and took Crimea in 2014. He mobilized forces on the border and said that he was going to do something about this if he didn't think his security interests were realized. And maybe we ought to take the possibility that this could get much, much worse quite seriously as well. Nobody thinks we should give Vladimir Putin everything he wants. Right. Mike is completely wrong here. None of us think you just give him more and more and more and more. The question is, do you have to recognize some of Russia's legitimate interests in order to bring this to an end? It makes us all somewhat uncomfortable here. In a perfect world, we would like to think that people who committed great crimes and people who made catastrophic policy errors, whether in the West or in the East, would be held to account. In a perfect world, that would be wonderful, but we don't live in that world. We live in a world that does have powerful states that do defend their security jealously, sometimes exaggerate the threat they face, something that certainly my country is not immune to, exaggerating threats and thinking it has to intervene in places for reasons that look absurd much later. But the point is, if you want to bring this to an end as quickly as possible, you have to start by recognizing Russia's security interests, the reasons they went to war. You don't stop there. You've got to think about Ukraine's interests too and the interests of the wider world. But that's where you have to start, as uncomfortable as that may be.
The obvious reason why you can't support this resolution is it has to be amended. I kind of felt like our colleagues wrote it. Of course, we need to have Russia's security interests in mind and talk about them. I've argued why, when we did that, it didn't work. And you didn't get to hear, but the quote from appeasement and why that doesn't work, that was John Mearsheimer I was quoting, by the way, when you're applauding. And I just fear that I just don't know the slippery slope. When does it end? You want this, you want this, you want this. And I think you have to ask the counterfactual. What if NATO never expanded? What if we just said, well, that's their sphere of influence, Russia's sphere of influence, great power politics, that's what they do. Weak powers that just have to submit, they have to accept whatever other great powers tell them. Imagine that world. Imagine how many other countries might be facing war with Russia today. Imagine if we just said, oh, Russia's invading, oh, we're not going to help the Ukrainians defend themselves. Let's just wait until it gets to a point where Putin is satiated. Imagine that world. That's a world where Russia is occupying lots of Ukraine. That's a world where Zelensky's probably killed. That's a world where way more people would have died than what is happening now. Is that really the way we want to, is that a way to end the war, by just recognizes Russia's national interest? And I want to keep reminding you, it's Putin's national interest, because not all Russians agree with him. And the second thing I want to say in closing is, you know, you keep hearing this is the way great powers behave, this is the way great powers behave, and little powers just have to do what they must, right? And I want to admit, power matters. Everything starts with power. When I teach at Stanford, I show a map of Europe for 1,000 years in 5 minutes. And what you see, rising powers, declining powers, borders changing. Yes, that's 1,000 years of history. But do we really want to keep living that way? Is that really the best option? Because if you think about the last 100 years, it didn't lead to peace and stability. It led to war, folks. It led to annexation. It led to millions of people dying between Germany and Russia and Germany and the Soviet Union. I was reading Bloodlands on the ride up here by Tim Snyder. Is that really a world we want to go back to, where we just let Putin do whatever he wants? That's not, it's immoral, of course. But our colleagues don't care about morality. I do. I think we should care. We should, no. Realism is as is. If I'm misrepresenting your arguments, I apologize. But I don't think the idea that might makes right and power should dominate, I don't think is moral, and I also don't think it leads to peace.
I think we all are ready to recognize Russia's legitimate security interests. And Russia is entitled not to be invaded. But we've already established that nobody has any intention of doing that. If you allow Russia to unilaterally define what its security interests are, then you're on a very slippery slope. I was born in communist Poland. We had 80,000 Soviet troops against our will on our territory, maintaining communism for 45 years. We didn't like it. We also had a joke. What is a secure border of the Soviet Union? A secure border of the Soviet Union is a border that has Soviet soldiers on both sides of it. And this is what Putin is doing again in Belarus, in Ukraine, in all those other places. This is not a war about NATO membership, which is a hypothetical possibility. This is the last gasp of Russian imperialism. This is Russia's Algeria, Russia's Angola, Russia's Ireland, above all. When an empire weakens and subject peoples want their liberty, it's always a very complicated and usually bloody process. Britain gave up its first dominions, then colonies, in a more graceful manner than most European empires did. It usually is very difficult for the metropolis to even acknowledge the otherness of the colony. As I mentioned, are peasants wanting a state? What's that about? This is about Russia's definition of itself. And it would be good for Russia to acknowledge that Ukraine is separate, because only then does Russia have a chance to become a normal nation state, rather than an empire, even theoretically speaking. So the Ukrainians are now telling the Russians, look, we are willing to die for our otherness. How many of you do we have to kill for you to acknowledge that? And the sooner the Russians admit that the price for maintaining empire is not worth it, the sooner this conflict will end. So we should acknowledge Russia's legitimate security interests, but Russia has to acknowledge the right of its neighbors to exist and to have security interests as well. Thank you.
I want to make it clear, I disagree completely with Radek on the point that Russia is an imperial great power and that Ukraine is the first train station on the line. And when they're done conquering and incorporating Ukraine, there'll be additional countries. There is no evidence to support that. It's true if you look at the July 12th, 2021 talk. It's true if you look at Putin's February 21st and February 24th talks this year. This is all about the West's effort to make Ukraine a bulwark, a Western bulwark on Russia's border. And the key prong in our strategy is NATO expansion. If you just go look at the documentation, you'll see an abundance of evidence of that. And you can find no evidence that Putin is an imperialist. What we have here, what we have here is a choice between two bad alternatives. One alternative is we can reach an accommodation with the Russians and, through diplomacy, work to create a neutral Ukraine. That's one alternative, and it's the alternative that Steve and I favor. The other alternative, and this is the Biden administration's policy, is to double down and to try to defeat the Russians in Ukraine, to bring the Russian economy down through comprehensive sanctions, and as I said on a number of occasions, to knock the Russians out of the ranks of the great powers. That's the alternative. You have to choose between those two. And our argument is that the second alternative is extremely dangerous, and it's going to be terribly damaging for the Ukrainians. It makes more sense to cut a deal here. And what you really want to think about is the one crisis before this that looks a lot like the situation we're in today, and that's the Cuban Missile Crisis. We now know that when the United States got involved in the Cuban Missile Crisis, what President Kennedy did was he went to enormous lengths to shut the crisis down. He cut a deal with Khrushchev. He cut a deal with Khrushchev that he thought was so objectionable to the American people that he told Khrushchev that he was going to have to lie about the Jupiter missiles in Turkey, which he was going to take out. Right? Kennedy understood we were talking back then about the threat of nuclear war. And Kennedy understood that you definitely wanted to do everything you can to avoid that. So what I'm saying to all you folks in the audience is you want to think like John F. Kennedy in this crisis, not like Joe Biden.
Wow.